Chris, I appreciate you doing this, man.
It's no problem at all. Thank you so much for even wanting to talk to me. Appreciate you.
Blood in the Garden, man. This is a phenomenal read, man. Multiple stories, a lot of flagrant stories about the New York Knicks teams in the 90s, man. I just wanted to see your input on how this book was made. How was the writing process for this book? I know you talked about writing this during COVID and talking to over 200 individuals. Even at the ending, you talked about apologizing to your loved ones about, borderline distancing from them because of this project. So if you can just share some of that.
Yeah, I lost a girlfriend over the course of this book project. I won't say because of it, but I don't think it helped during the pandemic. But yeah, I took a lot of time away from people, and I guess you kind of have to do that. Like initially, I kind of turned down the book project a time and a half. I don't know if I really did it the second time, but the first time I said, I'm really not that interested. And the person asked me why, because I think it was maybe the quickest that someone had said they didn't want to do a book. And, I had lost my dad a few months before this, really unexpectedly, a few months before I was asked to do it. And I just, like, mentally, I'm not sure I was there. And then I started thinking about the other reasons not to do the book. It's hard. You haven't done it before. I guess in my own mind, I was like, the book I write will be a book that is my thought process and my idea, as opposed to someone else kind of pitching it to me. So there was that part of it. And the other part, was that, well, I wasn't around for this team. I don't know anything about this team. And, so that was the part where when I said that part out loud, the literary agent who pitched the idea to me, his name's Daniel Greenberg, he said, well, if that's your hangup, Chris, I would encourage you to kind of look far and wide to see that there's plenty of people that, you have like a bestseller and a Pulitzer Prize winning book on Frederick Douglass. And obviously people that are writing about him today, do you think that those people were like, contemporaries with Frederick Douglass? I was like, okay, good point. Good point. It's probably an ignorant comment on my part. So he encouraged me. I think he encouraged me to talk to people in the field who'd kind of done this, who'd made a living basically, and a good living, on the idea of interviewing people for projects that they were barely alive for, sports projects in particular. So I made a point to talk with Jeff Pearlman, who I think he's done 9 books at this point. He'll have a 10th one coming out in the next year about Bo Jackson. And I think 7 of his 9 so far have gone bestseller. So he's made a really good career out of this. And is a fascinating writer, by the way, just as far as, if you liked my book, you would probably love Jeff's books. They're even more harder hitting than mine. So, I asked him, like, how do you do this? Like, you're not, you weren't alive for this really, or you weren't of age to have paid attention to this. You might know a little bit about a team, but like, how do you get to the place where you're like the foremost expert? And he's like, because there's no way to do it other than to just grind. Like, you have to kind of make up for all the stuff you don't know. You've got to read everything that's been out there about them before, books. You've got to collect every media guide that the team has put out over the years to figure out not just the players that were on the roster, but the people that worked behind the scenes, to get a sense of, who all you can contact. Because how else are you going to get to know more about a team than anybody else knows without just going all out and saying you're going to talk to every single person that's ever worked for the organization during that span, or at least try to. And that was essentially what I did for this book after he gave me that advice, after I signed on to the project, was to, and frankly, I'll say this too, before I finish. My literary agent was actually he viewed it as a positive that I didn't have background knowledge of this team as far as having dealt with them before, having covered it before, because the way he saw it, he was like, you're going to dig harder because of that, because you don't know those things. Whereas somebody that was around those teams back then would kind of just rest on what he thinks he knows and not really do the reporting and the digging. You would kind of fill that in with what you think your recollections are, which, your memory can fail you sometimes, or you can forget stuff, small stuff, big stuff. So he liked that I was coming at it from the perspective of someone that's unassuming. And because I was unassuming about it, I had to dig for everything. I had to talk to everyone. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of names in the book, and you read it, so you would know a lot of names I'm sure you probably had not read before, and people that I was leaning on pretty heavily in some cases for the book. And, on the one hand, you get some people that would say, why didn't you lean more on Ewing and Starks and Oakley and Riley? You can. Well, sometimes you can. I wouldn't have been able to in this book, but those people are the ones that are interviewed the most about this stuff. So you kind of imagine that after 15, 20, 25, 30 years after this team was formed, that if they had something really definitive to say about something that they've been asked about 30 million times already, they probably would have said it. So you kind of have more to get and more to glean from the people that have never been interviewed to at least see what they have to say. And they're also going to have a lot of great stories because they've never been interviewed before. And they probably, this is the thing that I try to really make hay with, they probably have firmer recollections of a lot of things, because for people that were with the Knicks for 2 or 3 days before they got cut in training camp, they're going to have more vivid memories of those 2 or 3 days than Patrick Ewing will, having been there for 15 or 16 years. Like Patrick Ewing, unless someone has a photographic memory, he's not going to remember a nondescript practice where Pat Riley yelled one time. Pat Riley yelled all the time. So like, why would that stand out to Patrick? So why would he remember what was said there as opposed to Patrick Eddy, or as opposed to Gary Waits, or, David Kane, or so that to me was a big plus for this book. And I think it's, I started at the very bottom as far as the sorts of people I was trying to talk to, the people that were with the team for like 2 days, 3 days, 2 weeks, the marketing people, the community outreach people, the secretaries that worked for these executives and answered the phones for them, because they'd never been talked to before. And they had fantastic stories. And so I don't regret doing the book that way at all.
Absolutely. You brought up Pat Riley. I want to just talk about him a little bit. Him making that transition from the Los Angeles Lakers and going to the New York Knicks. Do you feel he had the same coaching method, or did he brought like a whole different perspective with this team?
So I think I think it's probably undersold a little bit that some of the methods were the same. What I would say, obviously the Lakers were a team that was way more offense focused than the Knicks were, obviously. I mean, they were the Showtime era Lakers, running up and down, dunking, fast breaks, no look passes for Magic. So obviously there was all that. But because of that, I feel like that overshadowed the fact that the Lakers still could be a really, really aggressive team defensively at times. I'll put it this way. My agent and my book editor at one point, when we were debating book titles, I think my initial suggestion, I was the one that came up with the flagrant history of the 1990s New York Knicks. The initial title, if you go back and look at the first time I ever tweeted about this book and working on it, the title that I had come up with, the tentative one, was Blood on the Hardwood, the flagrant history of the 1990s New York Knicks. Everybody loved the subtitle. I think most people loved the title itself. My editor did not love the title because he was like, Hardwood, it'd be better if we could get something specific to the Knicks. So if we could do Garden, that'd be better. I think it was my agent that said, can't we do something like No Layups Allowed for the title? And I just kind of made a face. And he was like, why are you making that face? And I told him, I said, No Layups Allowed does fit the ethos of what those Knicks teams were. But Pat Riley first said that when he was the coach of the Lakers. That was something he told the Lakers first. So I don't like the idea of using that as the title, because he actually said that to the Lakers before he ever said it to the Knicks. I say all that to say that the Lakers, I mean, Pat Riley was aggressive with the Lakers too. I just think it was kind of overshadowed by how offense-minded that team was, that they had Magic Johnson throwing crazy passes every game and that they were going to run up the score on you. So it doesn't mean that they weren't physically aggressive, that he wasn't messaging to them the same way as far as like dialing up the intensity defensively. But how would anybody really recognize that with the way they played offense and the fact that they were known for offense? So stylistically, there was some of that with the Lakers, but he really dialed it up with the Knicks because he saw the Knicks didn't have the personnel that the Lakers did. I mean, the Lakers had multiple Hall of Famers. I'm trying to think, how many did they have at any one time? 4, 3? Worthy they would have had. They had Kareem, they had Magic, and I'm trying to think off the top of my head which other guys, if there were any other guys kind of during most of his era that were there that were Hall of Famers. I'm probably forgetting at least one more guy. But I mean, just some really talented guys on those teams. And the Knicks had Ewing. They had Ewing, they had Starks, they had Oakley, and they had Mason. So Mason, Oakley, and Starks were all All-Stars exactly one time. One of those years, both Starks and Oakley made it, and it was a year where the Knicks had 60 wins. So I'd have to go back and look at what they did statistically, but I think Oakley made it as a replacement for somebody else, and Starks made it. It was like the Knicks were so great that year that I think they basically said, we got to give them 2 All-Stars, and then Oakley made it as a replacement. But they weren't like clear-cut All-Stars. They were All-Stars exactly one time in their career. Mason wasn't even an All-Star with the Knicks. I think he was an All-Star with like Charlotte or with Miami or something like that. So this was a team that did not have like a superb amount of talent. They had Ewing, and he was a star, superstar, whatever you wanted to call him. So Riley understood that. Like, his team, even if he did have more talent, the talent was kind of more in the front court with Mason and Ewing and Oakley. So he didn't have a bunch of ball handlers to run up and down the floor. So he had to kind of emphasize his defense more. He didn't have these guys that were just going to run up the score offensively, but he had guys that were bruisers. He had guys that were good defenders. And basically what I think he did when he got to the Knicks was he said, the clearest way through this conference, like, you're going to have to go through the Bulls. The Bulls had won their first title the year before Riley got there. You're going to have to go through them. There's no way around them. And he looked at what the Pistons had done, the bad boys, and basically said to himself, I think their strategy still works. It's not that their strategy doesn't work anymore. It's that they're too old to really carry the strategy out. The strategy was working just fine until they got too old. So Riley basically said, let's try to dial up their philosophy a little bit. We might even have more guys on our team that are physical and can be physically violent than we're on their team. The difference between the Knicks and the Pistons was that the Knicks really struggled to score. They didn't have as much scoring as those Pistons teams did. By the way, the Pistons had Joe Dumars, they had Isaiah Thomas, they had a couple Hall of Famers on those teams. So anyway, I do think he dialed things up. He told the Knicks he wanted them to just foul relentlessly and make it difficult for officials to basically make decisions about what would be a foul and what wouldn't be, because even if they called 6 fouls in the first 2 minutes of the game, okay, they're going to do that because we're hacking. But if we keep hacking, can they really call fouls at that level, at that clip for the rest of the game? They're going to have to kind of make decisions about what to call and what not to, because the game can't go for 4 hours. So we'll desensitize them to calling fouls by fouling as much as we do. So he told him that. He told him not to help guys up. He encouraged them to knock people down and then said, I'm going to fine you if you help guys up. Like, there was a nastiness to what they did. There was a toughness to what they did. So I think it was more extreme and more pronounced with the Knicks, but he had some of that to him with the Lakers, and then he certainly carried what he did with the Knicks with him to Miami.
I want to transition to Patrick Ewing. Me growing up, especially people around me, we always looked at him as this quiet, laid-back guy, just does his job and go home. But as I got older, did my own research, reading books like Out of Bounds by Jeff Benedict, seeing the stories about what was going on in the strip clubs in Atlanta and other allegations with him. And you also pontificated about it in the book. Just shine that light on Patrick Ewing during that 90s era, because this is him going into his second phase of his basketball career. He's 5-6 years in at this time? Starting
when the book starts?
Yeah, when the book starts.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. You know what? It's interesting you bring that up. I was telling someone yesterday, I think the thing that is probably most different about my book, because you get books that are really deeply reported. I'm not the first person to do that. The biggest difference with my book from, I think, most books, every book has a superstar normally, at least when you're writing about a team. If you don't, I don't know, it's either not an interesting book or you're writing about a team that won without the superstar, which is the interesting part of it. In this case, he's obviously was the only star they had. And I wrote the book kind of trying to figure out, like, I wanted every key player of that era to have a chapter. At least the early 90s guys, like, they all needed to have a chapter. Starks, Ewing, Oakley, Mason, even Charles Smith got one, Pat Riley. Van Gundy obviously had one as well, and Don Nelson. But the way I saw it was, Ewing's the biggest star they have. Like, he was the player that defined that era for them. So I was trying to figure out where to place his chapter. And generally speaking, with most books that you read of this length and this level of seriousness or this level of reporting, you always put the star player first. Like, they're always what opens your book, basically. And you'll notice that the way I treated the book, Pat Riley is the first person I mentioned on the very first page of the first chapter.
Right.
I think the first words of it are 20 minutes into his first practice, Pat Riley looked a bit ruffled. So I opened the book with Riley, and that's there's a reason for that. Riley was the new character when you talk about 91. Ewing had been there since 85. Ewing was already an established star. There was something happening with Ewing at the time. He was going through like change in the sense that he was really tired of the Knicks at that point and wanted out of the team and was making that known and was trying to work his way out, was trying to force his way to free agency. But to me, because Ewing had been a constant for 5-6 years already, Riley was the story of that season. He was the new piece that season. So I wanted to put the focal point on him. And I think also Riley's a little bit more interesting than Ewing, at least a little bit more interesting, maybe a lot more. But Ewing, what I ended up doing that I think made the book unusual, because I couldn't really figure out a way to I just felt like it would have bogged the story down to kind of explain how important Ewing is for like a whole chapter in chapter 2 or chapter 3. Like, I lead the second chapter with Ewing, at least introducing him a little bit, and saying that he got booed and that they're throwing posters of him on the floor and everything like that. So I do introduce him, and we do introduce him as the franchise star, but my chapter about Patrick is until chapter 17. And the reason I did that was, to me, what you just referenced about some of kind of the misdeeds off the court and away from the court for him, I thought not necessarily that by itself, but I think the fact that his world kind of seemed to be unraveling by the time you got to 1997 was a lot more interesting to me to kind of shine a whole light on him for a whole chapter than it would have been to have said, Patrick Ewing was really good and he had a really historic college career and he was really important to the Knicks, even though they sucked for a long time, and blah, 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 blah. To me, I want someone to be going through a dynamic change over the course of when I'm writing about them. And for Riley, the dynamic change was joining the Knicks in the first place and the way he was going to overhaul the Knicks. For Charles Smith, it was talking about the idea of coming into this pressure cooker of an environment where he's got expectations and the idea that he's kind of the weak link of the team or the soft guy on the team. For Oakley, it was the idea that he was getting ridiculed by the league for how physically he played and the idea that he was going to have to tone his physicality down. That was a change he was going through. For Starks, it was the idea of trying to kind of fit in with the group that, there are certain rules that you kind of have to follow with regards to how much do I shoot, and not having had those rules before because he's never truly played organized ball for that long. It was just a crazy thing to think about, but just kind of like his IQ as a basketball player. So those were sorts of some of the changes he was going through. With Ewing, there wouldn't have really been that much to say early on in the book. So I wanted to wait until that chapter was like a life-changing year for him, a year and a half, where he shatters his wrist to the point where doctors aren't even clear if he's going to be able to play once they repair everything. He gets caught essentially having an affair with a team dancer that unravels his marriage of 7 or 8 years at that point. So to me, those are, he becomes the president of the Players Union, which later has ramifications for the lockout year where he comes into camp overweight and isn't in great shape. And so, struggles with his rehab. And because of that, his Achilles kind of goes on him in the middle of, a playoff run. So all that stuff to me was more valuable and more important. Like, if I'm going to choose one chapter to focus on him, I would rather it be that, because that's all of that is transformational, as opposed to the obligatory stuff about how important he was and the lottery and the Knicks. And I just kind of felt like that made a lot more sense. But yeah, I did think that stuff was important to get into a little bit as far as just some of the off-court stuff with him, because it's not something that I necessarily look forward to writing. Some people kind of, love being able to be, they're like a pig in the mud when you get to write about the indiscretions of people. I don't take pride or, I'm not looking forward to doing that. You're not trying to make light of something that's painful for somebody, but also it's stuff that's been out there to some extent. I think I added a little bit of reporting to some of the stuff that was out there about some of the other affairs he had, but that stuff had been out there before. And it's actually funny you bring it up. I had to have a lawyer read through the book. The publisher put a lawyer to read through every word of the book to make sure that we're not liable for something, that we won't be liable for something that I've written if somebody decides to read the book and they get angry about something. And I figured that would be a part that she really harped on. And when we got through it and there was like nothing on those pages about anything and any liability, I was like, everything with the Ewing stuff was okay. And she's like, oh yeah, that stuff's all been out there before. So it for as big a deal as I make it out to be in my head, and I think some people, there's kind of like a shock factor to see about the Stars, cheating written about, but it's stuff's been out there before. If anybody, I guess Mason was the guy that I was writing a lot about, whose stuff hadn't been completely out there before, as it related to some of the off-court stuff where there was actually something that was maybe had a criminal element to it that hadn't been out there before. Not huge, but stuff, at least some stuff.
Right. And Jeff Benedict, Out of Bounds. If anybody who's watching want to go a deep dive in Ewing situations, you're more than welcome to order that book. But yeah, man, Patrick Ewing, man. I looked at his stats the other day, and like the fact that he only had like one All NBA first team is wild.
It is. It's also not, because that was like the era that centers were really good, man. I mean, and when you really think about it, think about this. He was the other thing that that I think is lost sometimes on Ewing. Most of those guys were pretty young coming in, or they weren't young, but they hadn't really had that much NBA experience. Like Starks and Mason, were both essentially, they weren't rookies because they'd been on other teams before, but they hadn't really had like roles. So those were guys that were still kind of getting their feet wet in the NBA. They weren't young. Like, Starks, Oakley, and Ewing were all relatively the same age within a couple of years of each other, but they like had younger legs, fresher legs. But Ewing, by the time Riley even got there, was like in his late 20s, basically. He was not a young guy, young enough to be able to, again, to take what Riley was saying about trying to kind of remix what the Pistons were doing and do it better because they were younger. But he was not a young dude by that point. I mean, he came out in 85, and he was a guy that played 4 years of college. So what does that make somebody? I guess you start college, you're about 18 or so. 4 years is 22. And then you add another 6 because he was 6 years in by the time Riley got there. The man was 28 already. And he had bad knees like prior to Riley getting there. So you think about that, by the time you get in the middle of that era, you've got somebody like Shaq coming in. I don't think there's much debate over like who was the better, who was going to be the better player at that point, just because of just how dominant physically Shaq was. So, at a certain point, Shaq kind of took over the All-Star voting and was an MVP candidate and all those things. You had David Robinson, who, quite frankly, Patrick didn't play all that well against in his career. And you had Hakeem Olajuwon, and he lost titles to both those guys. Now, he didn't play in the finals in 99 against Robinson, and it wouldn't have been a fair fight anyway because they also had Tim Duncan. But, I mean, Hakeem was clearly better. I don't think anybody can debate that. He ate Patrick's lunch in the 94 finals. He was a defensive player of the year twice in a row. He won 2 MVPs, or 1 MVP or 2 MVPs. I mean, Hakeem was a better player. It just tells you how much overlap there was with those guys. It was a really competitive era where you had a lot of really, really good NBA centers. Maybe you could call it the golden era of centers, quite frankly. It was just a really tough run. It's part of what makes the Bulls so incredible that they won the way they did, because they did never have one. A center that I think would have even been a starter on most teams during those years. But yeah, that era was tough. It doesn't surprise me that much that Patrick only made one first team, just because there was some really great competition during those years.
Yeah, let's talk about the 1994 NBA Finals. Them going to face the Houston Rockets, going to all the way to a game 7. Were there any point in that series do you feel like they had a chance?
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, they won game 5 to take a 3-2 lead. So they go into Houston, all they need to do is win one game. Now, this was different time when it was a different time when the series structure was 2-3-2, meaning that the team that had home court advantage is going to play the first 2 games at home. Then the team that has the worst record is going to play 3 games in a row on the road, which a lot of people feel like is an unfair advantage for the road team, because even if you drop the first 2 games, let's say you're a good home team, that you play well at home. If you have the worst record, you're supposed to be disadvantaged, but all of a sudden you get the 3 middle games at home. You could theoretically take a 3-2 lead without winning any games on the road. So that's kind of why I think a lot of people have, basically said it was unfair. I think the last time we've seen that structure was like 2014 with the Heat and the Spurs. And that was LeBron's last run, if I remember correctly. But anyway, with Miami. So the Knicks took the lead at home in that series. They were up 3-2. They had to go play the last 2 games of the series in Houston. So they went into game 6. There were people that had the Knicks World Championship shirts that they brought ready to hand out to the players if they won. The Knicks ordered, probably hundreds of bottles of champagne that they had ready for game 6 in Houston, because all they needed to do was win and they were going to have a parade. The Knicks would have won the title. And not just that, but at the end of game 6, John Starks, on the last play of the game, 5.5 seconds left, had a chance to win the game. He was on fire. I think he had 16 points in the fourth quarter. The Knicks were trying to come from behind. They were down by 2 points, I think it was. And Starks lined up a 3 that looked like a pretty open shot. But again, Hakeem Olajuwon was a 2-time reigning Defensive Player of the Year. He made a spectacular play to basically cover 10, 15, almost 20 feet defensively and basically just stretch his arm out and get Starks' shot maybe with his fingernail, just to change the trajectory of the shot just a little bit. And so Starks had made 6 shots in a row to that point. He had scored 16 points in the fourth quarter. He was pretty much unstoppable. And he said for years, I promise you that shot was going down, because I could not miss. But Olajuwon got just enough of a fingernail on it to change the trajectory of the shot. I mean, to be honest with you, man, that plays out differently. Olajuwon gets hung up for a split second more and Starks makes that shot, the game's over. I mean, the buzzer sounded as the ball came down. So that shot, the Rockets wouldn't have had a chance to come back and take another shot if he makes that. That would have been the game. That would have been the series. The Knicks would have won. So they were extremely close. And not just that, they had a game 7, obviously, that you asked about. Starks shot 2 for 18. I mean, they only lost the game by 6 points. So if Starks does anything differently, takes fewer shots, if Riley pulls him out of the game, and I had a long excerpt run with Sports Illustrated this past week, Riley didn't play Rolando Blackman, and granted, he also didn't play him the rest of the series either, but the Rockets players that I talked to for this book told me multiple times, we were petrified that Rolando Blackman was going to be the guy to replace Starks in that game 7, because obviously Starks couldn't hit a damn thing. But Rolando Blackman played with the Mavericks for years, which are, they're in the same division as the Rockets. And so they all knew him, and he torched them his whole career. Now, granted, he was older at this point, a little bit more rundown physically, but, Rolando Blackman, if you look through his career splits, the teams that he, what percentage does he shoot against each team? How many points does he average against each team for his career? The Rockets numbers, his numbers against the Rockets are far and away the highest he has in his career. He's dominated the Rockets in a way that he hasn't any other team. And this is a guy that, when he left the Mavericks to join the Knicks, left as the Mavericks' leading scorer of all time. To this day, Dirk is the only guy that's outscored him. So, this guy could score. Again, he was past his prime. He retired after the season was over. But the Rockets were petrified that Riley was going to bring him off the bench to replace Starks, or even just to give Starks a 2-minute breather, just to kind of get him in the right train of thought and stop just chucking these bad shots. Riley never brought Blackman in, though, and some of the players have speculated to me, and Rolando said he's not sure, but he wonders about it too. Rolando got in an argument with Pat Riley a couple weeks before, and about basically the players wanting to bring their wives down to Houston for the start of the finals because none of them had ever won a championship before. They felt grateful to their wives for, holding down the home over the course of a long season. It had been a really long season. The Knicks were going basically 7 games with every team in each series. So it was a really long season for them. It was the longest postseason any team had ever had to that point. So, they wanted to celebrate the crowning achievement by having their families with them and bringing their wives down to Houston. And Riley said absolutely not, essentially because he saw it as a distraction at a time where they needed to be most focused. And Rolando didn't like that answer, and he basically wanted to understand why. Like, our wives have held everything down for us all year. We've never asked if they could come with us. They've never traveled with us before. Like, we've made it this far. Like, what would make you think we'd be distracted? Like, this is the NBA Finals. This is the most important thing to us. We're just asking, can we bring our wives? And Riley again shot him down and said no. And everybody on the team was kind of taken back by how dismissive Riley was of it. Because one, Rolando was, a veteran, a really respected veteran. And two, nobody was used to, at that point, seeing Pat Riley challenged in that way where someone kind of would question him a second time. And Riley did not generally take kindly to that because it never happened. So people have wondered whether or not Pat was whether he had a grudge against Rolando by that point, maybe if that's why he didn't play in a situation where people felt he should have. I guess we'll never know. Pat wrote the guy letters over the years, which I think can kind of be construed as apologies. Essentially, he said that it was the biggest mistake he's ever made to not bring Rolando in. Rolando's never written back to the handwritten letters that Pat sent him, but they absolutely could have won. To your basic question, they absolutely could have won. Something different happens in Game 7. I mean, it's 2 3-point shots or 3 2-point shots, however you want to put it. Or Starks not shooting, having the worst game of his career in Game 7 and shooting 0 for 11 from 3, or John Starks making the shot to win Game 6. Doesn't take much, but they absolutely could have won a title there.
I want to talk about a couple of games before that game, before Game 7, Game 5. You already know I'm about to head on talk about. I was only 2 years old when this happened. You're probably older than me. You probably can see how that experience was, but I can only imagine what would have happened if this situation, I guess, happened in our era. I guess in the social media era in 2020.
Twitter would have been fun.
It would have been wild. But what I'm talking about, who's watching, I'm talking about June 7, 1994, when O.J. Simpson is driving his white Ford Bronco on the run from the law. So, Chris, if you can, just share some of that for me.
Sure. And to your point, I was probably too young to really fully grasp that too. I was 4 when Pat Riley got hired. And then, by that point, I guess so I would have been 7. I guess I would have been turning 8 later that year. Yeah. I mean, so the game starts, but it's a day where, the police expected O.J. Simpson to turn himself in for essentially, double murder, double homicide. That they've got evidence and they've got different things that kind of suggest that O.J. was the guy that did it. So O.J. was such a beloved person, kind of just in media circles, had fans and everything, that they allowed him to turn himself in. But for those people that have watched the documentaries and the other stuff, that he didn't take that opportunity and actually use it. He went on the run, claimed to want to go see his mother one time before, turning himself in, but missed the deadline to turn himself in by. That's all happening as the Knicks and the Rockets are about to play. And then after the game starts, it's kind of discovered, or before the game starts, I'm sorry, it's discovered that OJ is actually around. It's just that he's like on the road. And so then there's the whole chase, a slow speed chase, all the helicopters following the car. Craziness is happening at the Garden because you've got any number of people, first of all, that know OJ, that are involved with this game. You've got the people from NBC that have the rights to the finals game, but OJ worked for NBC as a football analyst. So you've got Bob Costas, for instance, that knows OJ, that is like wondering what the hell is going on. You've got Dick Ebersol, who is the president of NBC Sports, who at one point used to rent one of his spare rooms to OJ. When OJ would come into town to do the analyst work to New York, OJ didn't want to stay in a hotel, so he would rent a room from the president, the guy that would later become the president of NBC Sports. So there was that. He had Ahmad Rashad, who, sorry to say this, Ahmad, but like probably had the worst, best men in the history of best men, between having Bill Cosby and having OJ Simpson, as he's marrying Felicia Rashad. There's a really famous picture, or not famous, but a really interesting picture of those three men, and then Debbie Allen and Felicia Rashad. And it is just the wildest picture to look at. Debbie Allen looks like she has so much shade in her face. Like she kind of knows something about the two men that are standing next to Ahmad. But anyway, so, there's that part. Ahmad Rashad's a sideline reporter for NBC, and he is nowhere to be found in the arena at one point because he's just weeping. I mean, like, essentially OJ had put out there what read like a suicide note. And he was mentioning his best friends and loved ones by name, in some cases, basically apologizing to them for not having been better or not having done better. And Ahmad was mentioned by name in that note. So he's like weeping, and I think the Madison Square Garden had the circus there recently, or maybe they were doing the circus in between days where the Knicks were playing. So there were hay bales in the arena for some of the circus animals, and Ahmad had like found a hay bale to sit on and was crying back in a corner where people couldn't see him. So they had, Dick Ebersol and the NBC folks had to find him so that he could actually do the game. So there was that, and you had, I talked to somebody that was sitting next to Maury Povich, who sat courtside during those years. And Maury had an open seat next to him for like the biggest game of the season to that point, biggest home game, at least. Like, who's not going to show up for a Knicks game that's, the last game of the season at home, regardless of what happens, but game 5 of the NBA Finals, that could put them closer to their first title in 21 years. It sounds crazy that someone would leave their seat wide open, but the reason the seat was open, Maury Povich is married to Connie Chung. And Connie Chung is a news anchor. News anchors have to work on a day where OJ goes missing. So that was, the whole thing was just completely wild. People weren't in their seats at all during the game, or at least a large chunk of people were not, because people were more enthralled and kind of more engaged in what was happening with OJ. And quite frankly, even some of the players were during the game. Like, they knew about it. Kenny Smith at one point was on the sideline during a timeout and was like talking to his teammates, and they were like, Kenny's got all these gestures and he's making his faces. And at one point, Rudy Tomjanovich, the Rockets coach, asked Kenny what he was doing and what he was talking about, because he was not focused on the huddle. And, Kenny Smith is a rotation player. It's not like he's a guy that doesn't play. Even if it was, it's the NBA Finals. And so Kenny Smith says, Coach, OJ's on the run. Like, he's fleeing the police. And Rudy Tomjanovich is like, I don't care. Like, we're tied in a series that is 2-2 in the NBA Finals. Like, this is your job. Focus. And it was like, kind of browbeating Kenny Smith over this. But then the very second that the timeout ended, Rudy Tomjanovich walked over to the scorer's table, and he wanted to know an update on the score. Not the score, but like essentially what was happening with the chase too, because he had to put on the one face in the front for his players, but he wanted to know what was happening. Like, OJ Simpson, I've tried to ask a couple times, like, what the modern day equivalent would be for that. And it seems a little bit too dramatic to say this, but like, the way that we think about it, especially as Black men, I think certain people kind of never fully embrace that idea of being Black man, or like being presented that way, that they want to be bigger than that or just more neutral than that. Like, Tiger Woods is probably one of the people that comes to mind for me, is someone where like that might be a little bit too big of a name in the sports world, but it might not be. Like, as far as like what the equivalent would have been if you had a modern day athlete that was doing that, or like someone that is on the grand stage now, like someone that's that beloved, but also someone that, if he gets in trouble and comes crying to the Black community, like a lot of people would embrace him, even though he hasn't really embraced us. And Tiger's never really fully embraced that. He always just kind of wanted to be seen as an athlete, not necessarily a Black athlete. And OJ had a lot of that going on, if you've seen the documentaries and stuff. But anyway, a fascinating instance. The Knicks did win that night, but I don't think anybody really remembers what happened in the game, because the game wasn't even seen by everybody, because a lot of the networks were turning from the game to that, or at best they were keeping the Knicks in like a picture in picture with the OJ stuff taking up most of the screen, or vice versa. But it was, New Yorkers and Houston people were probably the only folks that really fully saw the game, because in other parts of the country, I mean, there were 200 million people watching the OJ chase. It's still pretty much an unprecedented thing as far as how many people were watching that all happen.
One part of the book I like, it was Down the Flames on page 211, where you talk about the urban legend of Michael Jordan, possibility of joining the New York Knicks. I'm glad you was able to pontificate about that and just explain how that situation was handled. If you can you just share some of that?
Sure. Well, for me, my biggest fear in this book was always going to be, there's a lot of Knicks fans, a lot of people that care a lot about this team, even if they never won. The last thing you want as a writer is for someone to read your book and say, I already knew all that. I'll be damned if I'm going to spend 2.5 or 3 years and have someone say, I knew all that. So you're certainly going into it hoping to uncover even little small things. Like, you want to make sure every page, every couple pages, someone's learning something fundamentally new about the team, or something that at least describes something even more deeply than they thought they knew. But the other thing that you really want to do, you certainly want to have big things in there too that people don't know, that's never been out there before. I was telling you the thing about Rolando Blackman and the argument that he and Pat Riley had a few weeks before Game 7. That's never been out there. The players know that. I talked to Spike Lee at length the other day. He was like, how'd you know that? Like, he knew that, but very few people know that, outside the team. It's not something they talk about. But you also want to have stuff that, like, if people think it to be true, or have heard that it's true, or have heard the rumors about certain things, you also want to confirm what you can confirm. Or if there's stuff that's been like kind of blown out of proportion that, could have happened but didn't, but people think that it did, or people pontificate about the fact that it did, there's opportunities to shut that stuff down. And that's valuable too. You don't want to leave these like open interpretations to everything. And not to mention, like, I'm working on a book. So if I can definitively nail down that Michael Jordan almost did sign with the Knicks, of course I want to have that detail. So I'm asking a lot of questions to everybody, to David Falk, who represented Michael Jordan, and Patrick Ewing. I'm asking questions to Dave Checketts. I'm asking questions to Ed Tapscott, to Ernie Grunfeld, all of them, all the people that basically were brokers in this. I asked questions of the league, who would have had to have signed off on certain things for that to have happened, for Jordan to have come to the Knicks the way it was described. So I asked a lot of questions, and basically what it came down to, especially from the Knicks, they were like, it was never close to happening. That really Michael used us as leverage, but we were okay with being used for leverage, because that meant that the Bulls were going to have to pay more than they otherwise would have. So it's still kind of hurting them in a way, because now they can't go out and sign other people. So we're happy to be used as a foil. And quite frankly, the argument that you're referring to, I think, is that the story that's been put out there before, I think Sam Smith was the first one to report it, like back in 96 or 97, maybe later, I'm not sure. But Sam Smith, the guy that wrote the Jordan Rules, had a story on the fact that, what could have been essentially like if Jordan had signed with the Knicks, and the fact that he had a secret phone call with the Knicks about the idea of like, I'll come to you guys if you can meet this threshold, this certain amount of money. And I think the amount he wanted was 20 million, or that he claimed that they were going to be able to get him 25 million. The Knicks were going to be able to give him 25 million, and that he was going back to the Bulls to say, y'all got 24 hours, maybe 48 hours to get me at least that, or else I'm going to New York. And, the Knicks played ball with them a little bit. They did engage Jordan's agent a little bit, but they were like, all we've got basically is 12 million in our cap. Which was a lot of money back then, but like, it was nowhere near what Michael was seeking. Michael wanted closer to 30 million. He did end up with 30 million for that season, but the Knicks had 12, and there was no way around that. And it was illegal to circumvent the salary cap to basically go around that. But what Michael said to the Bulls is that the Knicks have all these side deals lined up for me, because it's New York. So there's a ton of endorsement potential, especially with me going to a bigger city and a new city. And the Knicks are owned by ITT Sheraton, which is like a hotel brand. And so they've got plenty of opportunities set up for me, and they'll make me the extra money that way. So it really annoyed the Bulls because they were like, that's not legal. That's not fair. It's not legal for a team to have other salary set up for you that's not just salary cap money. So they complained to the league about it and wanted to understand how that would be legal. And basically David Stern was like, I'm not getting in the middle of that. But really what it was that David Stern wanted Michael Jordan to get his money. He knew he'd been out of the league for a while. So that was what that was. But I don't think the league ever would have let the Knicks. I mean, it's illegal to circumvent the salary cap and give people money in other ways. So that wouldn't have been legal. I think that was more of something that was embellished. And it was funny because when I asked Michael's agent about it, David Falk, he didn't want to talk about it. He basically said, I'm not going to comment on any of that. Because it's like for him, he pulled a pretty good bluff on the Bulls, essentially. You know, and the Knicks have said that. The fact that Michael went back to the Bulls, I think, kind of suggests that as well. But, you know, what choice did the Bulls have other than to fear for the worst and basically say we can't allow the best player in the world to go to our arch nemesis? And so I don't think it was ever close to happening. I don't think Michael ever would have taken a pay cut to go to the Knicks just to make a point with the Bulls. But he got his money. So, you know, I guess it worked for him, right?
Right. Last question, man. What do you want your readers to take away from this book, and how should the New York Knicks in the 90s should be remembered?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you having me on again. I think for me, every now and then you get Twitter trolls that will say like, oh, who cares about the Knicks? Or like, why would anybody spend this much time writing about them? They didn't win anything, blah, 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 blah. Okay, true. I don't agree at all with the idea that people don't care about them. We'll see with this first week's book sales. You know, I get the impression people care a lot, and I get the impression that people love the 90s NBA a lot, and some people miss it a lot. And the argument that I made in the book, certainly in the last few pages of it, is that the 90s Knicks, if you really were intrigued by Michael Jordan and the Last Dance documentary, and you're really intrigued by the 90s NBA, which I think is either the greatest era of basketball or the second greatest, right behind the 80s with Magic and Bird. If you want to understand what the dynamics were in the 90s, you can't fully understand them without understanding how important the Knicks were to it. And I think people conflate and confuse the importance behind like having to have won and still being able to be important without having won the whole thing. I would make the argument that the Knicks changed the NBA more than Michael Jordan did during the 90s, which probably sounds crazy.
You got to break that down.
At least within the context of what I'm saying, Michael was obviously more important. I'm not debating that. Michael is the greatest player to ever live, is the greatest player to ever live, in my opinion. But what I'm saying, I don't think you have today's NBA or have it as quickly as we've seen it, without the Knicks basically bludgeoning people to where the league told them you can't do this anymore. More rules changed because of the Knicks than I would say any team in the last 20, 30 years. Easy. It's not even close. In the book, I lay out at least 5 or 6 of them that changed because of the Knicks. The league will say it was not because of the Knicks, but the league also doesn't shy away from saying, they're like, well, the Knicks were very much at the forefront of why we wanted to change this. So it is essentially like they changed it because of the Knicks, but they were so physical and the league was so afraid of its fan base and the people that they were trying to attract as fans, which I think, quite frankly, were like white people with money. The league was constantly worried. That was why the league was constantly worried about Malice in the Palace too, was the idea that like you didn't want to offend the sensibilities of white people that were going to come to games and scare them with these black men on the court beating up each other, and potentially spilling into the crowd and beating up people. So that was why they were so afraid of that moment happening. But the Knicks, it was like you were on edge about the Knicks having a Malice in the Palace situation every game. Like that was their fear. And the likelihood of that happening increased when the Knicks were throwing people on the ground, trying to hurt Michael Jordan, getting in brawls every couple months. So the Knicks were the reason that the flagrant foul penalty was essentially, as far as penalty 1, penalty 2, suspensions, that came in place because of the Knicks. Hand checking was gotten rid of essentially because of Derek Harper. and the Knicks. They moved the 3-point line in part because of teams like the Knicks, because while it seems like that tightens the game more, it actually spaces it out, because you don't want 3-point shooters to be able to take essentially a 15-foot three. If you can have a free throw line shot that's going to be worth 3 points, it's going to force rim protectors to step further out to prevent guys from getting really easy jump shots that they can make for 3 points. So that spaces the game out more. That was because of the Knicks. The leaving the bench rule in terms of fights, that was because of the Knicks. The idea of them changing the rule from, it used to be that you could swing at people, but if you didn't land the punch, that you wouldn't get suspended, which is the dumbest rule I've ever heard of. So they changed that rule to make it so now it's like, no, you don't have to connect on your punch. If you swing at all, we're going to suspend you. That was because of the Knicks. Like, there's a laundry list of stuff, man. And, frankly, I just don't think a lot of this stuff would have changed at the rate it did, to where once we got to like the early 2000s, essentially a few years after those Knicks teams kind of broke apart, the league was in a much different place with way more spacing and way more skill, because the league basically said, we can't have the Knicks or copycats of the Knicks in the league and dictating the way the league operates anymore. They didn't want that. They did not want the physicality to overtake the skill. So anyway, I say that to say this. The Knicks were they weren't a one-of-a-kind team, but I think they were kind of the last of a dying breed, because the league basically killed them and said, you can't operate this way anymore. But also all the battles they had and how many times they came up just this short. I described them as like the Forrest Gump of that era, where, if you've watched that movie and you've enjoyed that movie before, Forrest Gump was never quite the focal point of everything that was happening. It was always him being in the picture with the president and shaking the president's hand and then saying, I have to go to the bathroom. But obviously the president is still the focal point, but it's Forrest Gump being awkward that like you notice it, but like not completely. So there was that and all this other stuff with him, the Watergate stuff and everything else. Forrest is always kind of in the background, but he's never quite the focal point. The Knicks were like that too. We're like the Reggie Miller situation, and Reggie Miller having 8 points in 9 seconds and 25 points in the Spike Lee game. Like, Reggie was the focus of what was happening, but the Knicks were there. Michael Jordan doing what he did all the time. The Knicks were there, but Michael was the focal point. And obviously during the decade, Michael winning all his titles was the focal point, but the Knicks were right there in the conversation. The OJ chase, the Knicks were not the focus, but they were right there in the background of what was happening. So to me, you can't just ignore the background for 10 years. Like, the Knicks were always in the picture somewhere. They were like a bigger, not quite as hard to find version of Where's Waldo in the 90s, because they could always be found there. You just had to look a little bit. And to me, I don't think you can fully explain those stories of the 90s without the Knicks. You can't understand what Jordan had to fight through to win all the titles he won without the Knicks. Like, I watched the Last Dance documentary, and it felt like it gave the Knicks very short shrift to only mention them for 5-6 minutes. I think they were more of a part of that era than that. They were, the third winningest team during that era, and came this close to winning in 94. And hey, man, the first 2 times Michael retired, 94 and 99. I guess 93 and 98, but 94 and 99, those first 2 seasons, guess which team made it to the finals immediately after that? It was the Knicks. So if Michael hadn't been there, there's a pretty safe bet that the Knicks probably do win a title. But, I even though they didn't win one, I think that they're worthy of attention, because I think they changed basketball, again, maybe more than Michael did, through the context of just the way the rules shifted. And I think that stuff ushered us into what we're seeing now, where the game is completely rooted in skill.
Well, Chris, I appreciate you doing this, man. Blood in the Garden, this is a great read. I know they're probably going to tag this as a sports history book, but this is history. This is, at the end of the day, this is history. I look at this as a history book. Chris, tell them where they can find you at, man.
Oh, man, I really, really appreciate you again having me on. I am on Twitter at Herring. My last name's Herring, Herring, and then it's _NBA on Twitter. I've got links up everywhere on that Twitter page for where you can buy the book through Amazon. You can get it through the Simon & Schuster site. You can, at this point, you can get the book wherever. I know Barnes & Noble has gone crazy with stocking the shelves even before the book was out. with it. And I'm hopeful everybody will be able to find it everywhere. In New York, certainly, but even in other places, I'm hopeful people can find it.